In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the issue of diagnoses in clinical animal behaviour. This is a very important topic. We make diagnoses or evaluations of cases the whole time. However, there's a lot of inconsistency in how people go about this. What I want to do in the presentation is outline sort of three broad approaches that tend to be used. If not exclusively, then people tend to mix and match between them. And I'll spend most time talking about the approach we've developed at Lincoln, the psychobiological approach, and what a diagnostic assessment means in that context. So, broadly speaking, there are three paradigms used in clinical animal behaviour. What's known as the behavioural approach, based on behaviourism, hence the spelling without the U. The medical approach, that is more widely promoted in like human psychiatry, where it came from, and has been imported by certain vets within the field. And then the psychobiological approach. Now, these three approaches are not totally exclusive to each other, and the psychobiological approach takes perhaps the best of the other two in order to address some of the problems with them. But I just want to introduce the other two first so you can understand where the psychobiological approach fits in. So, in the behavioural approach, as I mentioned, it's grounded in the science of behaviourism, which was aimed at making the process of understanding learning much more scientific. By examining animals in very controlled situations, the idea was to find out the fundamental laws of learning. And it emphasises the importance of observation, and so makes reference to the environment, in terms of the stimulus and the behaviour of animals. Not surprisingly then the emphasis is on the importance of the environment in both the development and treatment, and evaluations also focus on how the animal's behaviour has changed as a result of reinforcement and punishment. People who subscribe to this approach very much focus on the treatment of signs rather than conditions. They look at the animal's behaviour and they focus on changing that behaviour without making too much reference to underlying motivational and emotional states. It's a popular approach widely used by dog trainers, most famously, sort of from my background, people like Barbara Woodhouse, who was the sort of TV celebrity trainer in her day, and more recently by the applied behaviour analysts working with companion animals, such as Friedman and colleagues. And there's a growing interest actually in using applied behaviour analytic techniques within the field of clinical animal behaviour. So, she's by no means unique, and you'll find reference to that approach widely in the literature. One advantage of it is that it is very disciplined, and it's clearly structured when it's reported very well, but it is limited to the individual. The second approach is the medical approach. This is typical of sort of the modern medical revolution, which is very reductionist and positivist. It focuses on what can be physically identified. So it structures problem behaviour in terms usually of disorders, problems in the nervous system, which need to be treated usually with some sort of physical intervention such as medication. The other thing about the medical approach is it tends to classify conditions into distinct syndromes. Although these are sometimes called diagnoses, they're more descriptions of clusters of signs. It's popularised by people like Karen Overall in the US and Patrick Pajar in France. Although it should be noted that the French approach and the North American approach are quite different if you read the relevant texts. Nonetheless, they follow the same principle in so much as here are a collection of signs, this tells you what the disorder is, and then here are recommended treatments for those collections of signs. It can be quite powerful, and it's useful to have that reference to internal physiology. However, it is limited in so much as it focuses very much on those physical elements and is in danger of excluding the individuality, and thereby removing the role of clinical expertise. But as I said, nonetheless, it does have some positive aspects. And, again, few people perhaps follow it in its purest sense, but they might combine elements of it. The idea behind the psychobiological approach was to address some of these issues that arose with both the behavioural approach and the medical approach. It needs to recognise that there are individuals, one of the strengths of the behavioural approach, recognise the importance of good observation, again from the behavioural approach, but also the physiological internal states that cannot be directly measured. So it's grounded in affective neuroscience, trying to understand the brain and brain states that relate to the control of behaviour. Behaviour is not controlled by the external environment. It is really fundamentally controlled by the animal's perception of it. So all external information is perceived and altered in some form before it is acted upon. And so we put a lot of emphasis on the understanding of affective states, because affective states determine what is important to that individual and set the strategies in motion for dealing with it. And one of the key things about that emotions is that animals are seeing the world and they're trying to classify it. And so we link emotions to classifying different types of stimuli within the environment. So within the psychobiological approach, we focus on understanding the context of the behaviour, when and where it occurs, motivational state, what the animal's behaviour is trying to achieve in terms of specific goal, but also its affective state in terms of why it is personally significant to that individual. And it's the approach we developed here at the University of Lincoln, and I've written several papers on the topic, and I hope in the sort of forthcoming years to produce more, to outline this more clearly to individuals. There is a chapter coming out in a book, hopefully later this year, which hopefully will help clarify for people who perhaps haven't done the Masters at Lincoln. So if we think about the implications of these three approaches from a diagnostic point of view, the behavioural approach is going to focus on contextual descriptions of the behaviour and observable environmental contingencies. The animal is behaving in this way because of this event in the environment. In the medical approach, the focus is going to be on biological malfunctions or disorders. The animal has an anxiety issue, for example, and people like Karen Overall have promoted the idea of defining it in terms of necessary and sufficient criteria. A necessary criterion is a feature that has to exist for the condition to exist, but it doesn't mean that just because it's there, the animal necessarily has that condition, because that sign could occur in other conditions, but without it, we can say safely that the condition does not exist. A sufficient criterion is one which, if it is present, it does mean that the animal has got the particular condition. However, it does not necessarily mean that it will always be there. So perhaps the most useful signs are ones which would be both necessary and sufficient. However, despite the efforts of many people, it's very rare that we find any necessary and sufficient criteria in the field of clinical animal behaviour. And this is perhaps because there is nothing that makes an animal with a behaviour problem uniquely different at a physical level to an animal that doesn't. Because fundamentally, a behaviour problem is a perception of a client. It is not something that can simply be reduced in the sense that the medical approach always seeks for that physical reductionism. And that is one of the big criticisms of that approach. Within the psychobiological approach, we recognise the importance of understanding when and where the behaviour occurs. So the diagnostic description should make reference to the context, and we should look to identify all of the relevant contexts for the problem behaviour in order to make sure that we can undertake things like a comprehensive risk assessment. We need to understand for each of the behaviours that make up the problem what the animal is trying to achieve. What's the specific biological goal? And that's the focus of understanding the motivation for the behaviours. We also want to understand the emotional arousal within the individual. And emotions are all about the individualisation of responses. we might both like chocolate, but if I like chocolate more than you and I see a bar of chocolate, it perhaps gives me more pleasure than you. And if I had to choose between a bar of chocolate and perhaps some other sweet, I would tend to prefer the bar of chocolate, whereas you might prefer the marshmallows or something else. That's what makes us different. And emotions allow for that individual titration. But there are, as I said, emotions are a way of also classifying the world around us. So they allow the individualization of responses, individual variability, so we're not just driven by internal gross physiological measures like hunger. We can have our own desires, etc., and pleasures, and also our own fears and things we want to avoid to different degrees. And these will be partly shaped by both genetics as well as environment. However, emotions also define the way that we relate to the environment, and they're quite important, especially in social relationships. So, for example, we can't just have a concept of mother, because your mother will be different to my mother. So I need to have that personal relationship with an individual that I define as a mother, and I will relate to my mother in a certain way. You will have a personal relationship with your mother, and you will relate to that individual who is different in your own way. And emotions allow us to have these affectionate relationships and ways of interacting with the social world. And also, we can apply emotions to aspects of the physical world as well. So what we see as safe might vary between us. That might depend partly on our experience, but also on things like our size. So a small place that I can crawl into, I might consider safe in certain situations. But if you're very large and you can't fit into it, it's of no good, so you wouldn't perceive it as being safe. So it wouldn't elicit the emotions of safety and security. So that's why we need to make reference to both motivation and emotion when considering the diagnostic process. Because the emotions also set in train a whole stream of behaviours, because they're directed towards achieving certain goals in a broad sense, whereas specific behaviours are associated with specific goals. So, for example, if I'm scared, that's the emotional state, and I wish to escape. How I escape, though, will depend on the context. I may be motivated to run. I may be motivated to freeze and try and hide. Or I may be motivated to fight. These are all expressions of fear. And different individuals may show different behaviours in similar circumstances. Or a given individual might show different behaviours in different contexts. So we can see that there is this interplay between context, motivation and emotion, which need to be understood in order to make a proper diagnosis. So let's consider each of these in a little bit more detail. We'll consider first the issue of context. As I've already indicated, the context refers to the circumstances in which the behaviour arises. And it is based on observable environmental circumstances surrounding the behaviour. So we wouldn't say that the context is when the animal is scared, because that is an inference. But we would say that in the presence of certain stimuli, the behaviour arises. So we're looking at those observable events. And then we think about context in terms of environmental circumstances that trigger the response. So, for example, the dog bites when he is touched. The question is that precise enough? Is it whenever? If we say when the dog is touched, we would imply if the dog is touched anywhere. But if it's only when the dog's feet are touched, then the context should be specified more precisely and say when his feet are touched. These are the immediate antecedents to the behaviour. We can also define context in terms of general circumstances. So in what situation? So it might be that, well, he bites when his feet are touched after he's been for a walk. That's a more general circumstance, the been for a walk, in order to set the scene. And there are a range of moderators of behaviour that can be important to the context. and identifying these is an important part of the diagnostic assessment. Let's now look at the issue of motivation. Motivation refers to the biological function or the goal of a specific behaviour. We can only infer this in the clinical setting. We can't measure it directly. And so what we tend to do is use an adaptation of the method used by applied behavioural analysts, a functional analysis of behaviour, where we look at the antecedents, the immediate triggers of the behaviour. We look at the behaviour itself and its form, and we look at the consequences, what reinforces, what maintains the behaviour, and also what might inhibit it. And on the basis of that, we try to infer what psychological variable relating to motivation is controlling the behaviour. So the actual description that leads to the inference should be consistent between clinicians. We may interpret it slightly differently, but we should be able to document the evidence and say, on the basis of these antecedents, I see this behaviour and I see these, I've identified these consequences that reinforce the behaviour. I infer that what the animal is trying to do in this circumstance is this. The sort of terms that are used to describe motivation are things like protectiveness, for example. So we might imply that the dog is trying to protect its food or protect itself. We might infer that the animal is hunting because of the antecedents of the dog's running behaviour, and it seems to stop when the rabbit goes to ground. So in that situation, we might want to infer that the dog is running around because it is hunting in that situation. The key important thing here is, as I said, any differences in opinion should rest with the interpretation of the evidence, not its content. And if we can standardize the way that we encourage people to describe what leads to their conclusions, then I think we can make good progress and improve the quality of conversations between clinicians. If we now consider the issue of emotion, now there's actually no consensus on what emotion is, even within the human field. And in this context, I'm referring to arousal of affective network systems, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. If you look at the field of emotion study in humans, then you will see the nature-nurture debate. You'll see people like Feldman Barrett argue that there is no concept of fundamental emotions, that they're all social constructs. And then you will see at the other extreme people like Jaak Panksepp, who talk in terms of there being very specific emotional circuits. Our approach is a somewhat middle ground. We recognise that we construct the world emotionally around us in line with the views of people like Feldman Barrett, but we suggest that there are fundamental networks, but these are much more flexible and less discrete than implied by people like Panksepp. But there are probably some fundamental emotional networks that allow the categorization of the world into certain broad categories. So emotions signify the personal importance of an event and the processes that result from it. As a result of categorizing the world in a certain way, we put in train certain actions as a result. Like motivation, we cannot measure emotional arousal directly in a clinical setting. It must be inferred. So how do we do this? Well, we do refer back to our functional analysis of behavior to see the triggers of the behavior and the consequences. That's one of the important parts. But in order to determine which emotions are involved, we need more than that. We recognize that there are certain emotional classes of stimuli, and I argue that we should perhaps consider 9 emotional classes of stimuli for most clinical work, and that is sufficient. I fully expect with time that this list may develop further, but in our current understanding, 9 is a useful point of reference. So we need to see whether or not the trigger fits into one of these 9 classes of stimuli, or it should do if the emotional arousal is occurring. We need to look at signs of arousal and whether or not that arousal is consistent with an emotional response. Emotions are elicited by both neurological and endocrinological responses, so they occur fairly quickly in response to certain triggers. However, emotional responses are dissipated much more through endocrinological means, and so emotional responses don't suddenly end when the stimulus disappears. And if the pattern of arousal doesn't follow that sort of pattern, then we might want to infer that actually there is very little emotion involved in this particular response. Responses that don't feature emotions we tend to refer to as habitual responses. A third feature of emotional responses is that they feature communicative signals. These are postures, actions, micro-actions made by the individual designed to try and communicate its personal state. And this serves an important function because it's important for other individuals within a social group to understand in what emotional state an individual is in order to respond appropriately and minimize conflict. And the fourth feature of an emotional response, it's a range of behaviours all directed towards a certain strategy. This is what we mean by behavioural tendencies. And they should all be relevant to that type of emotional arousal. And this approach, these 4 lines of evidence, this is developed out of what's known in the human field as component process theory, originally developed by Klaus Scherer. We should be able to describe signs of arousal, communicative signals, key stimuli causing the emotional response, and the behavioural tendencies in an objective way, in exactly the same way as we do for behavioural motivation. So there should not be differences of opinion between clinicians at that level. However, how we interpret this could perhaps be different. It might be that certain clinicians pick up on things that other clinicians haven't, or they emphasize the importance of it in order to make a sensible conclusion. And bringing about that sensible conclusion is part of the clinical skill. That's what it means sort of to have professional expertise in the area, knowing perhaps how much weight to apply and analysing the competing explanations and seeing which ones can be safely excluded. So I mentioned that there are 9 affective systems that we might want to refer to. So I'll call these the affective network referential system. And in the following slides, I'm going to explain for each of those what is the potential type of trigger, how it is perceived, what we call an emotionally competent stimulus. We'll talk about the behavioural tendencies and the types of emotions. I'm not mentioning at this point the communicative signals, simply because actually we know very little about that area, and it is very species specific as well, whereas the behavioural tendencies can be generalised across species, as can the emotionally competent stimuli. And the arousal levels I've already mentioned as to how they should feature, and they will depend partly on the specific behaviour that the animal is doing. So the first is we have desirables in the environment. These are things that the animal wants at a given time. These lead to sampling and seeking out opportunities with them, and we refer to this as the desire or the seeking system. Panksepp uses the word seeking in this context. Secondly, we have frustrations in the environment. These are things that the animals want but cannot access or less than expected. In fact, anything that limits the autonomy of an individual can be described as a frustration. So there has to be something that the animal wants, or some limit to the animal's autonomy for frustration to occur. This leads to increased focused effort aimed at achieving the goal. So Whereas when an animal is in a desire state, its behaviour is focused more on sampling. Here, the animal is much more single-minded in the behaviour. And refer to the response here as a frustration response or potentially as a rage response. And rage was the term used by Panksepp to describe this type of affective circuit. But as I said before, I tend to think in terms of networks rather than circuits because the effects are much more diffuse than perhaps implied by Panksepp's work. Thirdly, we have fears. These are things that are perceived to be potentially harmful to the individual. And they lead to self-preservation responses. I mentioned previously things like fight, flight, and freeze responses, and refer to this as fear. This will also include states like anxiety, the anticipation of something. And we consider it the same affective network. However, we have to be careful with the word anxiety because the word anxiety is also sometimes used to describe certain forms of frustration. If we're not sure what to do, we have a sort of conflict, then the word anxiety is sometimes used in that context. So we have to be very careful about making or drawing conclusions about the words that somebody is using. And that's why describing things effectively is so important. Fourthly, we have pains. These are things that cause actual bodily damage. And these result in a whole cascade of actions associated with withdrawal and protection. And we call this emotional response the pain response. Once an animal has experienced pain, often you will get fear of pain as a result. But that is an anticipation of pain and is different to the fear of harm in general that has not been experienced or pain that is not present. And it's important to remember that emotional responses are not just released by the presence of the particular stimuli, they can be released by its anticipation or anticipation of its loss or its disappearance. So any of the situations of anticipation of arrival, its presence, anticipation of its removal, or its immediate absence or loss can result in an emotional response relating to that affective network referential system. These four systems here all relate to perceptions of the physical environment. The first of the social emotions relates to affiliates. If you identify an individual as an affiliate, these are individuals that you want some sort of social relationship with, an affectionate bond, and with whom you can cooperate. They provide shared learning opportunities, and they can provide the basis of positive social interactions, play, etc., which can be seen also as partly a learning opportunity. So we will see playful social engagement, but we might just see affiliation activity through cooperative hunting, for example. So it's not just the play system that is described by Panksepp, and that's why we refer to this affective network referential system as affiliation. Sixthly, we have individuals who provide safety and protection. These are attachment figures, and this leads to a strong dependence upon them at times of uncertainty and insecurity. So if you are scared, you will turn towards an attachment figure. The associated affective system I refer to as attachment. Panksepp referred to it as the panic or the grief system because he emphasized the terror of the individual when that figure is lost. And if you think about it from a biological point of view, this is the relationship between an offspring and their parent, and the loss of the parents is a life and death situation. So it's not surprising that it results in sort of states of panic or grief. And again, that emphasizes that these affective systems are triggered not just by the presence of the relevant stimulus, but also by their loss as well. Seventhly, we can consider dependence. And this is the converse. So this is individuals who require care from another. And we get a range of caring behaviours elicited as a result. So, for example, a mother suckling her young will invoke this emotional system that, like Panksepp, I call the care system. Protectiveness towards the young as well, though, will come under the control of the care system. And it's motivated by the fact that there are young there to be protected. Now, whilst an animal might be protecting itself as well in that situation, when it comes under the care system, because of the emotional arousal, there is a slightly different or additional physiological elements that we have to consider relating to certain hormones. And that's why the protocols need to be adapted, and we don't just consider it as protection. And this is another example of why understanding the emotional basis to behaviour as well as its motivation is quite important. Protectiveness of young is very different to protectiveness of a bone. You would expect a mother be much more willing to take risks when it's her young, depending on the age of the young, because of her massive investment in those from a biological perspective. The fourth type of social relationship is with potential sexual partners who may provide breeding opportunities. And in the sorts of behaviours that are elicited in this situation are the behaviours of courtship, reproductive activity, potentially protection of a mate depending on the species, etc. Panksepp focused on particularly the reproductive activities, and he referred to this affective system as the lust system, and I think that's a good word to stick with. Finally, there are social relationships with individuals that we wish to exclude. Now, this is not the same just as not being interested in an individual. They attract no emotional significance. But there are individuals that somebody might wish to actively exclude from their social group. Within the ethological literature, there is a large reference made to detection of cheats within a social group, who are basically costing the group more than the benefits that they bring. And it seems reasonable to suppose that this also has an emotional association. I refer to this as the hate system. Hate might sound quite a strong word, and I want to make clear when I talk about hate, I'm not talking about it in the human sense. I have thought about calling it the sort of hostility system, but at the moment I'm sticking with the term hate. The important thing about hate is that it's directed towards individuals that the focal individual wishes to exclude from their social group. It can be expulsion from the social group, or it could just be avoidance. So if a dog doesn't want you to join its social group, it may not have a close relationship to you, but it might be responding out of hate. Now, when we have dogs on leads, perhaps reacting to other dogs, quite often the issues there are frustration, and there might be a tendency to think about it as hate. One of the features about hate is, as I said, it's directed at that individual, and it's not related to barriers or limits to the animal's autonomy. It's, I don't want you as part of the social group. I mentioned that some responses don't seem to have much of an emotional quality to that, and we refer to those as habitual responses. In order for an emotional response to become habitual, then the outcomes of the behaviour that is chosen must be highly predictable, and the response itself will be very consistent in form. And these are a couple of the requirements for habitual responding, but I'm not going to go into great length about that here. So in order to evaluate the emotional arousal of an individual, or the emotional elements, we need to think about the context of the behaviour and the emotionally competent stimuli. We need to look at the evidence from the arousal. We need to look at the evidence from behavioural tendencies, and also the communicative signals in relation to these. And on that basis, we can potentially exclude certain emotions from being involved in the response. And in the psychobiological approach, we're looking to not only gather evidence in support of certain emotions, but also to look to see which emotions we can safely reject. And that's what we mean by falsification. And that is partly what makes the approach scientific, the fact that it is both systematic and it also depends on falsification. It's important to note that an animal is not in one emotional state and not in another. We have these affective network systems, and again, this is why it's important to think of them in terms of network systems rather than circuits, and they are all active to a greater or lesser degree. Our experience at any given time is the product of how great the activity is in the balance of all of these different systems. And that affects the way that we perceive our environment or we perceive specific stimuli within the environment. And if the animal is responding to a particular stimulus, we're interested in the affective arousal in relation to that particular stimulus rather than the wider context. Although the wider context can be important in eliciting other aspects of effect like mood, and then the animal's personal predisposition, its temperament, can also be considered another factor contributing towards the response of the individual. So within the psychobiological system, when we're thinking about the particular response to a trigger, we're thinking about the emotional reaction, but we also need to note the animal's mood and temperament as well. And that is where things like the canine frustration questionnaire and the positive and negative activation scale can be very useful in order to profile aspects of the animal's temperament. Within the psychobiological approach, we also often evaluate impulsivity, which is the speed with which an animal is making a decision and how much reflection there is before it acts, because often animals are making poor decisions, and controlling impulsivity may actually be all that is required in order for the animal to make the sort of choices that we want it to do so. But there's a whole other series of lectures to be had on that. So, in conclusion, in the diagnostic goal, we're looking at an assessment of the context to describe the circumstances in which the behaviour occurs. We're looking at the motivation for the problem behaviours identified, and we're looking at the underpinning emotional arousal relating to the strategic priorities of the individual in response to a particular stimulus. However, we also want to consider evidence in terms of both internal and external transient modifiers of the response in terms of mood, transient modifiers of motivational state as well as affective state. So, for example, hunger state would be a modifier of motivation. And environmental influences, what we might call sub-threshold triggers. In these circumstances, then these make the animal more likely to engage in certain behaviours. Ultimately, what we're then trying to do, having described that, is to offer an explanation that makes most sense given all the available evidence. And it's important we consider all the available evidence. A common mistake that is made in behavioural diagnostics is people are of the opinion that a particular behaviour is due to a particular factor, and they just focus on that evidence and they don't systematically consider the evidence in relation to other motivational or affective states. Thank you.